Director of Product Development for Sony Computer Entertainment.
Excellent. Now tell us about the PlayStation. What is it? What does it do?
Okay, here at ECTS we're launching the Sony PlayStation, which is our entrance into the next generation video game marketplace.
The year is 1988. Nintendo and Sony have just partnered to make the next console named the PlayStation, that they plan to reveal in 1991 at the Consumer Electronics Show, or CES for short. Though unknowingly to Sony, Nintendo's president at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, cancelled all the plans. He believed the agreement gave Sony too much power because Sony retained all the rights to the PlayStation. After cancelling the plans, Nintendo formed a more favorable deal with Philips, giving Nintendo full control over whatever Philips produced, and they did all this still without notifying Sony at all, leading to Ken Kutaragi, also known as the father of PlayStation, and Sony's director of public relations at the time, Nobuyuki Idea, finding out 2 days before CES was set to begin. Kutaragi tried to gain contact with Philips, but to no avail. On the first day of CES, Sony announced their partnership with Nintendo and their new console to be called the PlayStation. But at 9 a.m. the next day, Howard Lincoln, chairman of Nintendo America at the time, announced that Nintendo had abandoned their efforts with Sony and had partnered with Philips in an event which has been deemed the greatest ever betrayal in the industry. Incensed by Nintendo's abandonment of the project, Norio Oga, then CEO of Sony, and Ken Kutaragi decided that Sony would develop its own console. Nintendo's contract breaking was met with consternation in the Japanese business community, as they had broken an unwritten rule of native companies not turning against each other in favor of foreign ones. Sony's American branch considered the idea of partnering with Sega, but when Tom Kalinske presented the idea to the Tokyo board, they decided against it. Kalinske recalled them saying, "That's a stupid idea. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware. They don't know how to make software either. Why would we want to do this?" Leading to Sony halting all research into a future game console. Despite what happened between Nintendo and Sony in 1991, Sony was still hopeful they could strike up a deal in which Nintendo would receive the bulk of the profits from the console sales. Some within Sony were angered by Kutaragi's perceived jeopardization of the company, and remained adamant that Sony stay out of the video game market. But Kutaragi insisted that Sony didn't retreat from the growing video game industry, and also that a deal with Nintendo would never work, leading to Sony cutting all ties with Nintendo on May 4th, 1992. To determine the fate of the PlayStation project, Oga chaired a meeting in June of 1992, consisting of Kutaragi and several senior Sony board members. In the meeting, Kutaragi unveiled that he had been secretly working on a CD-ROM-based console that could produce immersive 3D graphics. Kutaragi was confident that the chip he had developed was capable of 1 million logic gates, which exceeded the capabilities of Sony's semiconductor division at the time. Despite gaining the support of Oga, many at the meeting were opposed to Sony going into the video game market and saw Nintendo and Sega as toy manufacturers, while remaining adamant that Sony stay in the audio-visual market. After Kutaragi reminded Oga of the humiliation that Sony had suffered from Nintendo, he became one of Kutaragi's most staunch supporters. After the meeting, Oga shifted Kutaragi and his team of 9 from Sony's main headquarters to Sony Music Entertainment Japan, so as to maintain relations between Sony and Philips for the development of the DVD. The move to Sony Music Entertainment Japan proved crucial in the early development of the PlayStation, as the process of producing audio CDs wasn't very different from producing game discs. Sony Computer Entertainment was jointly established by Sony and Sony Music Entertainment Japan to handle their ventures into the video game industry. On the 27th of October 1993, Sony publicly announced that it was entering the video game market with the PlayStation. According to Shigeru Maruyama, the former CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment, there was uncertainty as to whether the PlayStation would focus on 2D or 3D graphics. But after seeing the success of Sega's Virtua Fighter in Japanese arcades, the direction became instantly clear. and 3D graphics became the primary focus for the console. Terahisa Tokuona later on thanked Sega for its release of Virtua Fighter to prove that making 3D games was a clear possibility. Maruyama stated that Sony further wanted to emphasize the console's abilities by using high-quality Red Book audio alongside 3D graphics. Wishing to distance the new console from the failed project with Nintendo, they originally planned to call it the PlayStation X, or PSX for short. Sony also formed SCEE, or Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, and SCEA, or Sony Computer Entertainment America, to handle the market in their respective regions. Closer to launch, Sony scrapped the PSX term in favor of just PlayStation. The console was also not branded with Sony's name anywhere on it, and according to Phil Harrison, the executive vice president of Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, because Sony's upper management feared the brand would be tarnished if associated with what they considered to be a toy. Since Sony had no experience in game development, it had to partner with third-party game devs, unlike Sega and Nintendo, which had well-equipped in-house developers that could easily port games from arcade to their consoles. After witnessing what happened to the Atari Jaguar and Panasonic 3DO because of the lack of developer support, Sony doubled their efforts into finding a good team of developers. After visiting hundreds of companies in Japan alone, throughout the negotiations they managed to gain support from devs such as Namco and Konami, as well as hundreds of others around the world. Attaining these companies meant securing Ridge Racer and Mortal Kombat 3. Namco's research managing director, Shigaichi Nakamura, met with Kutaragi in 1993 to discuss the PlayStation specifications. This also led to Namco using the PlayStation's hardware in the Namco System 11 for their arcade machines. Using the power gained from using the PlayStation's hardware, they developed Tekken to compete with Sega's Virtua Fighter. The Namco System 11 launched several months before the PlayStation. Even with the support of third-party devs, Sony still had no in-house devs. But this changed in 1993 when Sony acquired Psygnosis, later renamed SCE Liverpool, for $48 million. The acquisition of Psygnosis meant that the PlayStation would have more games ready at launch. Ian Hetherington, Psygnosis' co-founder, believed that without Psygnosis the PlayStation wouldn't be what it was. The purchase of Psygnosis also played a vital role in Sony making development kits for the PlayStation, as previously to develop for the PlayStation you would need an expensive Sony News workstation. With dev kits from SN Systems you would only need 2 extension boards which could be used on any ordinary computer. SN Systems went on to develop kits for the PS2 also. Sony strived to make development for the PS3 as inclusive and streamlined as possible, by providing programming libraries and cheap development kits usable in any PC, and also the use of CD-ROM as opposed to cartridges, which were more expensive. CD-ROMs were also not controlled by any one company, unlike Nintendo's cartridges, where they had full control over production. Even with the PlayStation's intercompatibility with PC, and the use of C as the programming language, some developers found the RAM restrictions to be challenging to work with, as it only had 3.5 megabytes of RAM. Kutaragi said it would be easy to double the memory, but the PlayStation's development team refrained from doing so, as it would raise the price, and Kutaragi also wanted to balance high performance, low cost, and also be easy to program for. He felt his team was successful in doing so. The PlayStation's technical specs were finalized in 1993 and its design in 1994, as well as its name also being finalized in 1994, but the price and release date were not. Sony released the PlayStation in Japan on the 3rd of December 1994, a week after the release of the Sega Saturn, at the price of 39,800 yen. The PlayStation sold 100,000 units on the first day, and 2 million within 6 months. Before the launch in North America, Sony unveiled it at E3 1995. With a price of $299,
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
beating Sega by $100, with the Sega Saturn being $3.99. The show also had a surprise appearance of Michael Jackson. Sega released the Saturn earlier than the PS1 to try and get a head start in the market, but it ended up upsetting quite a few retailers who weren't informed before the announcement at E3, leading to some retailers dropping the Saturn entirely. The PlayStation then went on to sell 100,000 units almost immediately, with Ridge Racer contributing to overall sales. Some critics even considered Ridge Racer to be superior to Sega's arcade counterpart, Daytona USA. It also had 17 launch titles, as opposed to the Saturn's 6. The PlayStation released in Europe on the 29th of September 1995. By November, it had already outsold the Saturn 3-1 in the UK. This was also aided by the fact that Sony had a £20 million budget for the Christmas season, as opposed to Sega's $4 million. By early 1996, the PlayStation had made $2 billion from worldwide sales. The PlayStation also had the upper hand with 400 games being developed for it, compared to the 200 for the Saturn and N64. The PlayStation's success was helped quite a lot by its very successful marketing and also its low price of just $2.99, which undercut the market by quite a bit. The fact that the PlayStation was made at all can be attributed to Ken Kutaragi's determination to make an entrance into the gaming market. And even with all the skeptics at Sony, he still pushed through and made it work. Even with the limitations of the time, he managed to pack 1 million logic gates into the CPU, and also managed to pack 3.5 megabytes of RAM onto the main board, more than some computers at the time. And so marks the end of this documentary about the PS1. Thank you very much for watching. Please consider subscribing, drop a like, leave a comment, and have a great day.